involve human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, and there's a paper which is saying that that number should be more like 50%. Okay, and I'll just go through, I'll go through the climate aspects, and this is interesting. Chinese state media just shame Greta Thunberg. They say, judging from the results of her personal growth, her body, her carbon emissions are actually not low. I mean, this is the state media. It's here in threat. Plus, citizens Fridays in the future, protests and so on, could disrupt the Chinese system. And you need something to balance the negative stuff. Okay, so all of this stuff I've tweeted out recently. So this is an
Essendon forward Cale Hooker told ABC Sport that his team's strong start was critical.
I think we had a pretty consistent mindset, but although they're on the bottom of the ladder, the last 2 weeks they actually played pretty well, so we certainly didn't take them lightly, and when you get off to a good start, it makes a big difference.
Earlier, the Giants beat the Eagles by 16 points, while Collingwood led for most of their match against Port Adelaide before losing by a single point. In rugby league, the Parramatta coach Brad Arthur admits the emotion surrounding the death of Manly legend Bob Fulton inspired the Sea Eagles yesterday and backfired against the Eels. Manly thrashed Parramatta 28-6, costing the Eels second spot on the NRL ladder. Arthur, who used to be on Manly's coaching staff, says Bob Fulton's death after a battle with cancer motivated the Sea Eagles and the Eels couldn't cope.
It's incredible, and I'm not one to float my own boat, but I know the hard work that does go into it, and not many people do. Apart from probably Del, because she never sees me, but there is a lot of hard work that goes into it, so it is really good to get the reward.
Now, Tom, that in fact was not Brad Arthur, rather. That was Fremantle midfielder Kiara Bowles. She capped off a stellar AFLW season by winning the club's Best and Fairest award. Some news out of the West this morning.
Thanks very much, Louise Ransom. Back in half an hour with more sport. In about an hour, the local share market's set to open down 5 points. The SPI 200 in futures trade down 0.07 of 8% to 7,026. The Aussie dollar buying 77.2 US cents this morning. Let's take a look at the weather for the capital cities. In Brisbane, partly cloudy with a top of 24. It's 18 now. Heading to Sydney, a shower or two today with a forecast top of 22 degrees, currently 15. In the national capital, partly cloudy today in Canberra with a top of 17 degrees, currently 10. In Melbourne, it's 10 as well, warming up to 19, some cloud increasing. Pretty similar situation in Hobart, cloud increasing today with a top of 18 degrees, currently 8 in Tassie. In Adelaide, some high cloud today with a top of 25, 19 at the moment. For Perth, showers today in the west, easing later though, a top of 16 degrees, it's 8 now. And in Darwin, mostly sunny with a top of 32 today, currently 25 degrees. Australian Eastern Standard Time is 9 o'clock, it's 8:30 in the centre. In WA, good morning, it's 7 o'clock and it's news time.
With ABC News. The head of an Australian immunisation advocacy group says it's unfair to put all the blame for vaccine hesitancy on the media. The Federal Health Secretary, Brendan Murphy, says unbalanced and sensational news coverage has caused a flattening in demand for COVID vaccinations in Australia. But Immunisation Coalition Chairman Dr Rod Pearce says the media is not solely to blame.
Some audacity when the leading scientific officer to suggest that someone else's fault. While there may be some of the media that are influencing it all, it remains a responsibility of the government and the departments and the senior health leaders to actually educate us.
3 members of the Australian skateboarding Olympics team have been forced back into quarantine in the US after testing COVID positive. Melissa Brown reports.
A coach and 2 athletes have contracted COVID after travelling to the US for an Olympic Games qualifying event in Iowa. They include 13-year-old Melbourne skateboarder Charlotte Heath, who's told her social media followers she's disappointed to be forced out of the competition. Teammate Poppy Olsen says most of the team had received 1 dose of a vaccine in Australia and were due for the second after the competition.
I think we all knew what it was going to be like and we'd have to be safe. This was their last shot to really get in, and so it's pretty devastating for those girls.
Skate Australia says the 3 team members are being closely monitored and the rest of the team has returned multiple negative results.
Labor backbencher Joel Fitzgibbon says if the party doesn't wake up to itself, he won't recontest his marginal seat. He's warned the Labor brand's in trouble because of mixed messaging on climate change and the future of industries, including coal mining. At the weekend, Labor suffered a swing against it in the New South Wales Upper Hunter by-election, a seat which overlaps his federal seat of Hunter. Joel Fitzgibbon says he's working towards the next election, but wants to see the party change its ways.
I plan to run for Labor at the next federal election. I was out doing the inevitable fundraising last week. I'm still working as hard in my electorate as I ever had before, but I will say this. I won't stick around if the Labor Party doesn't wake up to itself.
A new report shows South Australia is falling behind other mainland states on key mental health emergency indicators. Gabriella Marchant explains.
The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare report shows South Australia had the highest proportion of mental health related ED presentations in the country. Only Tasmania fared worse than SA on a raft of ED indicators, including the average time for a patient to be seen and median length of stay. The cost per day of acute mental health admissions was also the highest in Australia at nearly $1,400. However, SA was the only state where all mental health facilities met national standards, according to an independent audit.
2 people have been killed and 12 injured in a shooting at a family house party in the US. More from CNN's Paulo Sandoval.
State investigators here in southern New Jersey have been at the scene for well over 12 hours now, processing the scene of what Governor Phil Murphy has described as, quote, a horrific mass shooting. There's a lot that we don't know yet, though, especially when it comes to motive, a possible arrest. We do understand that there's at least a third person that did sustain some life-threatening injuries as the community searches for answers to questions that many people are asking, including what's actually behind this.
The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says until Palestinians can live in dignity, the truce between Hamas and Israel may not last. It marks the first major diplomatic crisis for the Biden administration. Antony Blinken has confirmed US support for a two-state solution.
We have to start putting in place the conditions that will allow both sides to engage in a meaningful and positive way toward two states.
To sport, veteran golfer Phil Mickelson is closing in a historic victory at the US PGA this morning. The 50-year-old chasing his 6th major title, leads by 3 strokes with 3 holes to play. With a victory, he'd become the first player to win a men's major championship after turning 50 and the oldest major winner of all time. Jason Scrivener's finished best of the Aussies at 1 over. Matt Jones picked up 4 shots on his final round to finish at 2 over. Chelsea secured 4th place in the English Premier League despite losing to Aston Villa 2-1 on the final day. Manager Thomas Tuchel took over in January and has led Chelsea to a Champions League final against Manchester City next week and is now a place in the top European competition next season. In this morning's other matches, Liverpool beat Crystal Palace, Leicester lost to Tottenham. ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
Your company this morning. I'm Thomas Ariti, making news a tragedy in northern Italy. At least 14 people have died after a mountain cable car fell to the ground. Also today,
If we can't find a way to help Palestinians live with more dignity and with more hope, this cycle is likely to repeat itself.
ahead of his trip to the Middle East, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says unless Palestinians can live with dignity and hope, that fragile ceasefire with Israel it might not last. And in China, 21 athletes have died after encountering extreme weather during a race. Some of the country's top extreme distance runners are believed to be among them. First this hour, during the past couple of months, Australia's COVID vaccine rollout has hit a number of stumbling blocks. So patchy supplies, high-risk groups being left out, and a reluctance by some to get a shot because of fears about rare but serious blood clots. Critics say public confidence is being eroded by secrecy and mistakes, but the Federal Health Secretary Brendan Murphy has told tonight's Four Corners program that if anything is to blame, it's the media coverage. Adam Harvey reports.
Australia's vaccine strategy has lacked transparency from the start. Queensland's Deputy Premier Stephen Miles says state governments were left in the dark.
Throughout last year, it was very clear that the Commonwealth wanted to keep the vaccine planning to themselves, and they did that throughout. We found out about, for example, the purchases of the different vaccine products when the Health Minister and the Prime Minister called press conferences and made those announcements.
Epidemiologist Professor Michael Toole from the Burnett Institute believes the federal government hasn't got enough information out to the public.
I think one of the failures of the federal government communications has been this lack of transparency around the quantity of vaccines we have in the country, the quantity we're administering, and what we can expect.
The Grattan Institute's Stephen Duckett, who's a former secretary of the Department of Health, says the secrecy continued through the early stages of the vaccine rollout, and more detail about future vaccine arrivals is essential.
I think there needs to be much greater transparency, and I don't understand why we don't, because people's confidence is being sapped away at the moment by the schmozzle that's taking place in the vaccination program.
The current Health Secretary, Professor Brendan Murphy, has told Four Corners that there's good reason for the lack of candour. we can only disclose what our commercial deals allow us to disclose. So if we have a commercial in confidence provision in our purchasing clause, we'll be breaching that, and we have to comply with that. I would agree that the more transparency, the better, and that's what we've tried to do. Health experts and frontline workers like Dr. John Gerard, the head of infectious diseases at the Gold Coast University Hospital, says Australia is vulnerable to a COVID outbreak.
I am concerned that Australians seem to believe that this virus is just going to go away. It's not. It's going to come here, and if you're not vaccinated, there is a good chance you will be infected.
Professor Brendan Murphy insists Australia's in a fine position and says the public's willingness to get vaccinated is being affected by news reporting. The biggest impact on hesitancy is sensationalist media reporting. I would have thought that the blood clots that AstraZeneca causes, very rare risk of blood clots, but nevertheless a real risk, and people are frightened of it, that's the thing that's impacting it. It is, but it depends how you report it. Of course it is a factor, but it sometimes has been reported, in a not particularly balanced way. We want to be transparent, but we want people to understand that the risk of this blood clot is really tiny, and if you're a vulnerable person, the risk of severe COVID is high. The federal government has abandoned setting any vaccination targets, but Professor Murphy says he's confident that all Australians will be offered a first dose and possibly both doses by the end of the year.
Adam Harvey reporting there. You can watch his Four Corners report on Australia's vaccine rollout at 8:30 tonight on ABC TV. Town in regional Victoria has just become one of the first in the country to buy a community battery with help from government grants. The mid-sized batteries are the latest trend being floated as a solution to Australia's grid woes and as a way for communities to store their excess renewable energy. Yakandanda's medical centre, supermarkets and even fire station now have solar systems and batteries along with many households. Totally Renewable Yakandanda spokeswoman Juliet Milbank says the battery's part of the town's push towards 100% renewable. Speaking to ABC News Radio a short time ago.
Well, a community battery is basically bigger than a household scale battery, but smaller than the typical commercial big batteries that you hear about, like the Hornsby battery in South Australia. So it's not commercial scale, it's not household scale, it's somewhere in between. And in particular, our community battery is for the benefit of our local community. It helps supply power and keep our network reliable at the local level.
For those who aren't familiar with Yakandanda, how many homes and businesses is this battery going to supply?
Our township is around about 1,000 people, and initially it will basically help supply power to customers of our community energy retailer, Indigo Power. Indigo Power is a social enterprise and was started out of Totally Renewable Yakandanda, but is now a separate entity, and they will run and operate the battery. And basically they have a 65 kilowatt solar array that will charge the battery during the day, and then during the evening that power can be released into the grid for customers of Indigo Power to use. And it can, if you have to run a certain number of households just off the battery for a period of time, it could supply 30 to 40 households for about a day.
Are batteries like this in use anywhere else in the country, to your knowledge?
It's one of the first batteries of this type. It's what's called a behind-the-meter retail-facing battery. So there are other batteries being trialled in sort of different setups around the country, but this is the first one of its type, and it's meant for the direct benefit of local residents, and it's not a commercial proposition as it is.
The town, the doctors, the supermarket and the fire station have solar panel systems and batteries along with many households. How important is being sustainable in your area to local people?
It's enormously important to our township, and there are many reasons for that. I mean, one of the obvious ones is people's concern around climate change and reduced emissions, but we're also a small regional rural community. And as anybody who has lived in regional or rural Australia will know, the incidence of blackouts and brownouts is much higher in those areas than in metropolitan areas, and this has been the case for a very long time, even before solar panels became quite popular in the last 10 years or so. So that means also that your appliances and light bulbs and all those sorts of things don't last as long because you have spikes in your power supply quite regularly. And it also means you suffer the inconvenience too. So anything which improves the stability and the reliability of power supply means a lot to regional people. And so our target for 100% renewable energy is bound up in all those things, both reducing emissions, reliability, resilience, and ultimately we want to set up a town so that in the case of the main electricity line going down from Wodonga, we can still run the essential services of the town because we'll be able to island certain parts of the town and run independently of the main grid. But that doesn't mean disconnecting from the main grid, but it gives you greater capacity, greater resilience to be able to operate in times of emergency.
Now, experts have said that this technology is a game changer, but there are logistical barriers. For example, they're fairly expensive, aren't they? Can you talk us through them?
There are logistical barriers because of the way our electricity network is set up. It was originally designed as a one-way system to go from large commercial power stations one way to end users, and we're now in the process, the transition phase really, of developing a grid which is two-way, which has what are called distributed electricity or energy resources. Lots of small, discrete generators that can all contribute to the grid. And so you have to essentially redesign the grid and the way it operates. You have to redesign the marketplace to cope with that and to be able to remunerate all the people who are putting power into the grid. And you also have to redesign a little bit some of the hard infrastructure too. But there are enormous benefits, and it's certainly doable. I mean, society has coped with many other more complex technological challenges. There is nothing about this challenge that is out of the realm of practicality. It is all completely doable. It just needs a little bit of application to achieve that.
So this project was possible with help from government grants. You want to see more buy-in from the government. What specifically are you after?
Well, we'd just like to see a little bit more assistance in that commerciality of batteries in this transition phase, because it is very new. Batteries are still very expensive, but as I stated earlier, the benefits to communities are just enormous. And even though batteries are expensive, to put in a battery in a particular area that has issues with its power supply is still much cheaper than network transmission upgrades. They can be enormously expensive, and this is why many infrastructure providers are starting to look at batteries as very good alternatives, because the cost of network upgrades can be enormous, and batteries can achieve all the same outcomes for a cheaper cost. So help with the commerciality of batteries, and also help with research into what is the best way of integrating batteries into our network for the benefit of everybody, for end users, for providers, for retailers.
Totally renewable Yakandanda spokeswoman Juliet Milbank there speaking with ABC Radio, News Radio's Anna Pikett. Thomas Ariti with you this morning, making news. A mountain cable car has plunged to the ground in northern Italy, killing at least 14 people. A child was also in a critical condition. Also today,
the priority right now for humanitarians is going there, assessing the situation, assessing the needs to be able to answer to the needs quickly.
A volcanic eruption in the Democratic Republic of Congo forces thousands to flee their homes in the city of Goma, and
we really don't know what's happening to him right now, and we know how cruel KGB can be.
European Union members are set to impose sanctions on Belarus after an opposition activist was arrested when his plane was forced to land in Minsk. The Australian Food and Grocery Council says up to 16,000 Aussie jobs could be at risk if companies don't keep up with global competitors. The organisation wants to double the industry's value by 2030 by exploring new export markets, growing investment and advancing research. Food and grocery manufacturing, pretty significant. It's the nation's largest manufacturing sector, employing 276,000 people. 40% of them are in rural and regional areas. The council's chief executive, Tanya Barden, joins us live now. Morning, Tanya.
Good morning, Thomas.
Thanks for your time. 16,000 jobs. That's a big number, pretty concerning. How did you come up with that figure?
So we've had Warren Hogan from EQ Economics do some analysis for us, looking at what are three growth paths that the industry could take. So looking forward out to 2030, if we really had a strategic focus on the sector, we could double its size to $250 billion by 2030. But if we do nothing and the industry just sort of plods along, then there's a risk that it could go into decline and the worst case scenario, potentially lose up to 16,000 jobs over the next decade.
So when we look at the different scenarios here, your Sustaining Australia report, that's what it's called, it's come up with three scenarios for the future of the industry. What are they?
That's right. So we've got the high growth path. That aligns with the vision set in the government's modern manufacturing strategy of doubling food and beverage manufacturing in this country. It is an ambitious growth path, but it is a sector that does have strong fundamentals in Australia, taking Australian agricultural produce, transforming it into high quality products. So we could achieve that 250 policy levers adjusted, incentives provided for the industry to invest in order to achieve that. And then, as I say, the other two scenarios are what happens if we do nothing, or if we lose international competitiveness and we go into decline.
You've seen, just looking at the trends, you've seen profits in the food and beverage manufacturing sector actually fall in recent years. What's behind that?
Yeah, look, the last decade has been tough for food and grocery manufacturing. We've had the conflation of two major issues. One is that we've had a big increase in input costs over the last decade. They've risen by 49%. So that's everything from energy to transport to commodity prices. And at the same time, wholesale prices have only increased by 24%. And that's largely due to the fact that we have a heavily concentrated retail sector, which limits the ability of food and grocery manufacturers to be able to pass through rising costs. And that's quite a unique factor, and has also come about partly due to the entry of Aldi into the domestic market and the increased retail competition over that time. It does mean for food and grocery manufacturing, though, that you've got this big difference between input costs and output selling prices. And that's very different from what you see in the rest of the manufacturing sector, where normally you expect those to track over time.
Okay, what about the pandemic? And I guess allied with that is the explosion of online shopping. Has that had an impact on the industry?
Yeah, so the pandemic has had mixed results for the industry. So obviously the health measures that place restrictions did mean people were shopping more from home, and so there had been an uptick in supermarket sales. That has normalised now back to regular shopping behaviour. But countering that was that we did have higher costs of developing products during that time. So the cost of freight, the cost of sourcing ingredients, and even inputs like packaging had increased during that time. And then, of course, you've got the impact of the drought and the bushfires as well that have impacted on the industry. But look, it's not all doom and gloom if we have a really strategic focus on the sector and we get the right policy measures in place, then it could have a really strong impact on Australia's post-COVID economic recovery.
In terms of future-proofing the sector there, what interests me here is you want to see more of a focus on robotics, artificial intelligence and 3D printing. How would that improve the competitiveness of Australian projects?
Yeah, so if you look at food and grocery manufacturing worldwide, it is adopting a lot more advanced manufacturing technologies. And other countries are putting a lot of focus around this sector post-COVID. They're putting a lot of tax incentives and grants in place to support this sort of transformation. And it really does a couple of things. One is it can improve the efficiency of the business if you've got more automated technologies. But it can also improve the agility of the business. So that if you've got consumers that are rapidly changing their demands, you can use 3D printing, you can use virtual reality to be able to test not only consumers' responses to products, but also within the production process, how you can adjust and change business models as well as production processes. There's also a real interest from consumers around digital information. So increasingly, consumers want to know what's in their product, where it's made, how it's made, whether it's ethical and environmentally friendly, whether it's healthy. And the industry really needs to get on board with greater use of digital technology throughout the supply chain so that ultimately the consumer can scan their product and find out more about it.
Fascinating technology, but let's say robotics though, some people listening to this might think, hang on, that might mean job losses.
No, so robotics will help the industry stay competitive and allow the industry to grow. So if we don't adopt that sort of technology, we will lose our competitiveness and manufacturing will move offshore and we will lose the jobs. So it's a really important part of retaining a good, strong growing employment base is to have robotics and automation that sees the industry grow and continue to have, high-skilled, well-paying jobs in the sector.
Tanya, we're out of time, but look, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much for your interest, Thomas.
That's Tanya Barden there, the Australian Food and Grocery Council Chief Executive. And let's turn now to sport. Louise Ramsden, good morning.
Good morning, Tom. Some news just in. 50-year-old Phil Mickelson has become the oldest winner of one of golf's major championships with victory at this morning's PGA Championship at Kiowa Island. The American finished at 6 under par, 2 shots clear of Brooks Koepka and Louis Oosthuizen. It's his 6th major victory. He's the first player to win a men's major after turning 50. And Australian golfer Sarah Kemp has finished 4th at the LPGA event in Virginia. Taiwan's Wei-Ling Shu claimed the title at 13 under, 2 shots ahead of Thailand's Moria Jutanugarn. After leading on Friday, Kemp recorded a 1 under par final round to finish 4 shots off the pace. And members of Australia's Olympic skateboarding team have tested positive to COVID-19 after a qualifying event in the United States. On social media, 13-year-old Charlotte Heath from Melbourne says she's in quarantine after testing positive and was not able to compete. 11 Australian skaters and staff left Sydney on May the 3rd for California before travelling to Iowa. Closer to home, in the AFL, Collingwood's difficult season took another painful twist with a 1-point loss to Port Adelaide at the MCG. Alistair Nicholson reports.
The Magpies led nearly all day. Port Adelaide finally hit the front, approaching time on of the last quarter, and Collingwood never saw the lead again. Port Adelaide hung on to win their 7th win of the season, 8-11-59 to 8-10-58. Earlier in the day, GWS climbed into the AFL's top 8 at the expense of the reigning champions Richmond, a 16-point win over the West Coast Eagles, while Essendon continued its promising resurgence, a 4th win for the year, a 72-point victory over North Melbourne, 22-9, 141 to 10-9-69. Alistair Nicholson, ABC Sport.
Fremantle midfielder Kiara Dowers has capped off a stellar AFLW season by winning the club's Best and Fairest award. She won the league's highest honour earlier this year, along with the AFL Coaches Association Champion Player of the Year. It's the 3rd consecutive year she's been named the Doctor's Best, and Dowers says it's a great honour.
It's incredible, and I'm not one to float my own boat, but I know the hard work that does go into it, and not many people do. I probably do because she never sees me, but there is a lot of hard work that goes into it, so it is really good to get the award.
Dockers coach Craig Cooper has also signed a 2-year contract extension, which will see him stay with the club until at least the end of the 2023 season. Well, in rugby league, Parramatta coach Brad Arthur admits the emotion surrounding the death of Manly legend Bob Fulton inspired the Sea Eagles yesterday and backfired against the Eels. Manly thrashed Parramatta 28-6, costing the Eels 2nd spot on the NRL ladder. Arthur, who used to be on Manly's coaching staff, says Bob Fulton's death after a battle with cancer motivated the Sea Eagles, and the Eels just couldn't cope.
They beat us on every part of the field, I reckon. Obviously they knew they had a lot of emotion in their performance, and they backed it up, and we did.
In yesterday's other match, Penrith maintained its perfect form this season, racking up 11 straight wins with a 56-12 thrashing of South Sydney. Perth Glory remains confident of making the A-League finals despite a 1-1 draw with Macarthur last night. The Glory's 2 points out of 6 ahead of a tough road trip this week. Coach Richard Garcia says his players back themselves as the season's conclusion nears.
We've got, I think it's 12,500 kilometres to travel and 3 games in a week, but looking in that dressing room, there's a bunch of guys that are up for that challenge.
In other matches yesterday, Adelaide United beat Melbourne Victory 1-0 and Sydney FC defeated Western Sydney Wanderers by the same scoreline. In basketball, the return from retirement of club legend Tim Conrad has helped propel the Illawarra Hawks to a 93-81 win over the Cairns Taipans. The 35-year-old stepped away late last year when new coach Brian Goorjian came in, but he was brought back 2 weeks ago. In football overseas, Chelsea has secured 4th place in the English Premier League despite a final-day defeat to Aston Villa 2-1. Manager Thomas Tuchel took over in January and has led Chelsea to a Champions League final against Manchester City next week and now a place in the top European competition for next season. In the NBA, Australian basketball, Ben Simmons has starred as Philadelphia beat Washington 125-118 in the first round of the playoffs. Simmons recorded a playoff career high of 15 assists, the most by a 76er in a playoff since 2005. Elsewhere, LeBron James' LA Lakers were beaten 99-90 by the Phoenix Suns in the first match of this series. And finally, Tom, there's plenty happening to game sport this morning. It was a busy Monday, of course. Max Verstappen won the Monaco Grand Prix overnight as well. Carlos Sainz with Ferrari was second, and Lando Norris in his McLaren was third.
Thanks very much for the update, Louise Ranson. The local share market set to open down at 5 points. In futures trade, the SPI 200's down 0.07% to 7,026. And the Aussie dollar this morning is buying 77.3 US cents, 54.6 British pence, 63.4 euro cents, 84.2 Japanese yen, and $1.07 New Zealand. Let's take a look at the weather before we head to the news. In Brisbane, partly cloudy, with a top of 24 degrees, currently 20. For Sydney, a few showers today, 22 the top. It's 16 now. In Canberra, a partly cloudy day ahead in the national capital with a top of 17 degrees, currently 11. In Melbourne, it's also 11 at the moment, a top of 19 today with cloud increasing, and a similar scenario in Hobart. Cloud increasing with a top of 18. It's 9 now. For Adelaide, high cloud and 25 the top today, currently 20. Heading west to Perth, showers, easy later though, with a top of 16 degrees. It is currently 9, and in Darwin, sunny and 32, 25 at the moment. Australian Eastern Standard Time is 9:30, 9 o'clock in the centre, 7:30 in the west. It's news time.
With ABC News. The federal government says it's hopeful every Australian who wants a COVID vaccination will be fully immunised by the end of the year, subject to supplies. It's now expected up to 2 million doses of Pfizer will be delivered each week from October. The government has recently resisted setting firm vaccine targets, and the Federal Finance Minister Simon Birmingham says the ambition rests heavily on consistent international supplies.
That's certainly our hope, but there have been many uncertainties in the vaccine rollout to date, and I think we need to continue to be honest about the fact that we can't control every aspect of global supply.
The head of Victoria's Public Transport User Group says fines for those refusing to wear masks on public transport are reasonable. From today, people not wearing masks on trains, trams or buses in Victoria could face $200 on-the-spot fines if they refuse to accept a mask from roving police officers. Tony Morton from the Public Transport Users Association says in the context of a pandemic, the new measures are acceptable.
Things like not having a valid ticket or putting your feet on the train seats. It's a similar approach we're taking here, and as long as we are in a pandemic and we have an unvaccinated population, it probably does make sense.
The incoming Nationals MP for the New South Wales Upper Hunter says he's pushing for an expert panel to oversee the evolution of the region's economy. David Lazell is expected to secure the seat after advocating for coal mining jobs during his election campaign. He says a lot of different points of view in the community need to be heard.
We have to prepare for the future. We're talking about an expert panel group to talk about, come up with a board with unions, community groups, Chamber of Commerce, that we could actually start planning for the future. That is all still happening. I think the most important thing is we don't need to panic right now about losing our jobs.
New research shows despite the eased COVID restrictions, younger Australians are still drinking more than they were last year. More from Jean Kennedy.
A national survey conducted by the Alcohol and Drug Foundation has found that more than 20% of Australians do not associate any harm with drinking. That's despite new guidelines being released last December, recommending people should not drink more than 4 drinks a day or 10 drinks a week because of the risks of harm, including injuries, dependence and diseases like cancer. The survey found younger people do not associate drinking alcohol with any illnesses or injury, and more than a quarter of 18 to 24-year-olds say they're now drinking more since the COVID lockdowns.
The Northern Territory's Labor Senator says there hasn't been enough work done to investigate the Territory's water supply and the viability of a cotton industry. Cotton growing trials have been underway in the NT and Western Australia, and there are plans to build cotton gins in Katherine and Kununurra. Senator Malarndirri McCarthy is part of a Senate committee that will hear about federally funded cotton research and development this week. She says an inquiry is needed.
I'm on the Regional and Rural Affairs Transport Committee of the Senate, and I would suggest that what we should be doing is actually having an inquiry into those capabilities, because we also have to look at the concerns that have been raised interstate.
An apparent power surge has caused delays at Brisbane's domestic airport this morning. Check-in, security and baggage services have all been affected, with departing flights the worst impacted. The Brisbane Airport Corporation says it's not clear what's caused the issue or when it will be resolved, and is encouraging passengers travelling today to contact their airlines first. It comes after Virgin's check-in system was impacted at the weekend, causing a backlog for passengers at airports around the country. Lithuania wants the European Union to recommend avoiding Belarusian airspace after opposition activist Roman Protasevich was arrested and his Lithuania-bound plane was forced to land in Minsk. The BBC's Sarah Rainsford reports.
Mr. Protasevich was wanted in Belarus, accused of organising mass protests last year against President Alexander Lukashenko. He's the founder of the extremely popular Telegram channel Nexta, that's been banned in Belarus as extremist. The journalist's arrest and the audacious way it happened is causing an international outcry, with many referring to it as a hijacking of a flight between 2 European capitals with well over 100 people on board.
This is ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
ABC Company this Monday the 24th of May. I'm Thomas Ariti, making news mountain tragedy, 14 dead, including a young child after a cable car falls to the ground in the Italian Alps. Also today,
with my sickness, I've been under like a lot of mental stress, and I really wanted to come back, and this was like my 4th time trying to come back home.
returning Australians express their relief as India continues to lead the world with a number of COVID deaths reported each day. And EU leaders demand the release of a Belarusian opposition activist after his flight to Lithuania was forced to land in Minsk with reports of a bomb threat. First this half hour, the UN Security Council has welcomed the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and is calling for an immediate humanitarian aid effort for Palestinian civilians, especially those in Gaza. On the 3rd day of the truce, thousands of displaced families are returning to their homes in Gaza, or whatever is left of them. The UN estimates at least 6,000 people have been left homeless. Deutsche Welle's Pablo Foliolaes reports.
Picking through the rubble, in just 11 days, homes, shops and roads have been wiped out, and hundreds of lives have been lost. Survivors of the airstrikes on Gaza City are dealing with the aftermath. It's an inexplicable feeling. Frustration, fear, sadness. I can't process what happened. I don't understand. I'm in shock. In just a couple of seconds, minutes, our building, our uncle's building, our neighbor's building, all were flattened. Residents are returning from wherever they could find shelter. Some feel like nowhere is safe in Gaza.
Where are you going?